Welcome back, everyone, to another week and another episode of Interventions and Detentions with your host, Brad. This is the podcast where real conversations happen and, of course, the real learning begins. And I think you're going to get into this week's episode. I know I'm excited about it because it's probably going to bring back some memories and it's going to bring some things to the forefront too. Because if you work in education long enough, you realize there are a few universal experiences that just about every student and every educator has shared along the way. You know, things like the smell of dry erase markers. We all recognize that one. How about the panic of a fire drill right in the middle of your best lesson? And of course, the absolute chaos and excitement of a school field trip. Now think back for a second. Seriously, think about when you were a kid in school. Let's all go back in time. We always jump in the time machine here at Interventions and Detentions. Let's jump in, go back, think about when you were a kid in school for just a moment. What was your most memorable field trip? Was it the zoo? Maybe a science museum? Maybe a historical village where someone in colonial clothing was churning butter and pretending it was, about 1785? Or maybe your memory has nothing to do with the destination at all. Maybe the memory is the bus ride itself, the noise, maybe the snacks. I don't remember snacks. We didn't get snacks in school. We were 80s kids. That's my generation. Limestone playgrounds, no snack breaks during the day, no snacks on a field trip. We're lucky if we got a lunch, for crying out loud. So, maybe for you it was the snacks. I don't know. Maybe it was the kid in the back who suddenly discovered that the bus driver does not appreciate barking like a dog for 40 straight minutes. Maybe it was the kid that threw up on the bus on the way home. I think I've had that happen before. When I think back, I think one of my most memorable field trips was my 6th grade year going to Chicago from Indiana. We took about a 2.5-hour bus ride. We actually took tour buses, which was amazing. They did that, I'm going to guess, because they didn't want to have to stop 1,000 times on the way there for bathroom breaks, because those tour buses had, built-in bathrooms. But we went and toured the Field Museum and Science and Industry, I believe. It was a great day and a great field trip, and thinking back, I don't know that I would take 6th graders into Chicago anymore, but it was a very fun field trip. Beyond that, I don't know. As a teacher, we did an overnight field trip at Camp Potawatomi, the YMCA Camp Potawatomi in South Milford, Indiana. That was cool. We did that for several years, and I loved it. As a teacher, we had some great experiences with kids, getting them outdoors and doing some fun things. I can remember the Underground Railroad game that we'd play at night. That was the best. It was so much fun. We would scare the heck out of those kids. And then as a principal, I actually had some 5th grade classes that went to the Indiana Indiana Dunes National Shoreline, overnight camping up there at the dunes. That was a great experience too. We went on a 4-mile hike to look at all the different land tundras and areas where we basically went out, did a horseshoe and ended up out at the shoreline and then back again. No bathrooms along the way. Had to rough it. That was kind of fun and interesting for kids. But I've had some great experiences with field trips over the years, and that's what led me to this episode today. Because when you strip it all down, a field trip is essentially this. It's taking a large group of children out of a controlled classroom environment, out of the school building, and hoping everything goes according to plan. And sometimes it does, sometimes it did, and sometimes, let's just say the stories that come back from field trips can live forever in the teacher's lounge, at home on the weekends, pretty much wherever. But here's the interesting thing. Field trips actually have a much deeper history in education than most people even realize. What many people think of as just a fun day away from the classroom actually started as a serious educational philosophy about how learning should really happen. So today we're going to unpack the evolution of field trips in American schools. We'll talk about where the idea came from exactly and how field trips became one of the most memorable traditions in education. Why the expectations around them changed so dramatically, and how schools fund them, how virtual learning has created entirely new versions of them, and finally, what the future of field trips might look like in public education. Because if you talk to educators today, you'll hear something interesting. Field trips haven't disappeared. but they've definitely changed. And depending on who you talk to, that change is either a good thing or something that we might want to rethink. So let's start at the beginning. Where did the idea of school field trips even come from? Well, if we go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, education in the United States was going through a pretty significant transformation. Before that time, most classrooms operated in a very, very traditional way. We've seen it before in all the pictures. The students sitting in rows, teachers lecturing, students listening, textbook-dominated instruction. Learning was mostly about memorization and recitation. But a group of educators and philosophers started questioning whether that approach was actually the best way for students to learn. Imagine that. One of the biggest voices in that movement was an educational philosopher named John Dewey. Dewey believed something that feels pretty obvious today, but was actually pretty radical at that time. He believed that learning should be connected to real life. His philosophy centered around something called experiential education. In simple terms, that just means learning by doing, learning from experiences. Instead of just reading about something in a book, students should experience it. Instead of only hearing about the natural world, students should observe it. And instead of memorizing facts about communities, students should explore the communities that they live in. And this is where the concept of field trips really began to take shape. Educators started realizing that the world outside the classroom was full of learning opportunities. There was nature, museums, factories, farms, local businesses, government buildings. All of these places could serve as extensions of the classroom. So early field trips began appearing in schools as part of something called the nature study movement. Teachers would take students outside to observe plants, animals, and ecosystems directly. Wow, that sounds like what we do in our Kinderforce program at my school. Wow, interesting. The idea was simple. If students could see learning in action, they would understand it more deeply. For example, imagine teaching a lesson about agriculture. You could show pictures, you could read about farming, or you could take students to a farm and let them see how it actually works as it's happening. Which experience do you think students were going to remember? Exactly. And that philosophy drove the earliest versions of field trips. Now, here's something interesting. Early field trips were often much simpler than what we see today. Teachers might walk their class to a nearby river, they might visit a local market, they might observe construction happening in their community. Transportation wasn't always a bus. Sometimes it was just walking. Which might make some modern administrators slightly nervous if we're being honest. But the point was immersion. Students stepping into real environments connected to their learning. And for many educators at that time, it was incredibly powerful. So as the 20th century moved forward, field trips started becoming more common across American schools. Part of the reason was transportation. School buses became more widely available, road infrastructure had been improving, and cities began investing in public institutions like museums, science centers, zoos, historical sites. All of these places recognized something important. Students were a major audience. And many of these institutions began designing educational programs specifically for school groups. This is when field trips started becoming what many of us recognize today. A class would board the bus, they'd travel somewhere designed for learning, and the experience would often include guided tours, demonstration, and hands-on activities. Museums began creating school tour programs, zoos developed educational presentations, historical villages offered reenactments and immersive storytelling, and for students, these trips were unforgettable. Because for many kids, especially in smaller communities, field trips exposed them to places they might never, ever visit otherwise. Art museums, science laboratories, planetariums, remember those? They were the best. Theaters, national landmarks. Field trips expanded students' sense of the world, and that's something educators have always valued. But something else happened during this period as well. Field trips also became a cultural tradition in schools. They weren't just educational opportunities, they became events, and students counted down to them. Teachers planned them months in advance, parents volunteered to chaperone, permission slips went home in backpacks, and the day of the trip often felt like a celebration. You remember the excitement of the day that the field trip got here? And let's be honest, for students, the learning part wasn't always the main attraction. I know it wasn't for me. Sometimes the highlight was simply being on the bus with our friends or eating lunch somewhere other than the cafeteria. A lot of times it was on the bus. Maybe it was visiting the gift shop and convincing their parents that a $10 rubber snake was an essential educational purchase on that field trip. But even with all of that excitement, the core purpose of field trips remained connected to learning. Students were experiencing things beyond the walls of the classroom, and for decades, that approach worked well. In fact, many educators look back on that period from the 1960s through the 1990s as something of a golden era for school field trips. You know, if you talk to teachers who have been in education for 30 or 40 years, they'll often tell you that field trips used to be a lot simpler. Not necessarily easier, but definitely simpler. Back then, planning a field trip didn't always involve layers of paperwork, standards alignment, documents, detailed risk assessments, taking defibrillators. We send defibrillators with our kids on field trips. You know, we didn't have to worry about those stuff 30, 40 years ago. A teacher might have an idea. Maybe they were teaching a unit on ecosystems. So they thought, let's go to a nature center. Or maybe they were teaching American history and they planned to visit a historical site or living history museum. They would talk to their principal, fill out a few forms, send permission slips home, and off they went. There was trust in teacher judgment about what constituted a meaningful educational experience. Field trips during this time covered a wide variety of destinations. Zoos were and remain incredibly popular. Science museums, aquariums, state parks are a big one. If you're close enough, historical battlefields, theaters, government buildings are always a good go-to. Some classes even visited factories or local businesses to learn about industry and careers. I can remember taking trips to the post office and businesses in our small town of Wilkeville, Indiana, back when I was in elementary school, just to learn about how things operated. We take our kindergarten students to a local pizza place called Marlowe's Pizza in Wolf Lake, Indiana, and they learn how to make pizza and how to run a business. It's really real life experiences. And the structure of those trips were usually pretty straightforward. Students arrived, they participated in guided tours, they watched demonstrations, maybe they completed a worksheet or activity, maybe, and then they returned to school. Were these experiences always perfectly tied to academic standards? I mean, when I think back, not always, not necessarily, but they were still powerful learning opportunities when it came down to it, because students were seeing the real world applications of the things that they were studying. How important is that? And those experiences often stuck with them for years. I tell people all the time, I just said it at our kindergarten roundup the other night, kids are not going to remember their reading textbook from third grade, the math worksheet on double-digit addition and subtraction. They're going to remember experiences, the ones that we give them at school, whether that be field trips, Christmas concerts, book fair that's going on right now. Those are the experiences that will stick with them forever, okay? It's so important to help foster those in our kids. In fact, if you ask adults today about their school memories, most adults, me included, are going to remember the field trips. That's the one thing that almost always come up. Remember when we went to blah, blah, blah? I know if I asked kids in my class, remember when we went to Chicago in 6th grade? How cool was that? We actually did an overnight stay field trip in a YMCA campground, or Camp Pokagon it was, Pokagon, in 5th grade. How cool was that? And we had to meet up with other schools that we had 3 elementary schools that would eventually verge together in middle school. So we didn't really know these kids. And here we are spending the night with them at campground. And it was a scary but fun experience. And I remember For dinners, they brought in McDonald's cheeseburgers for some reason. I don't know. That was kind of cool. You would have thought we would have probably cooked on a fire when we, if we were camping, but whatever. It was McDonald's both nights that we stayed there. We remember the field trips, though, guys. We remember visiting the museums, the campgrounds, the zoos, seeing the animals at the zoo, maybe feeding the animals at the zoo, standing inside the historical buildings and imagining what life was like centuries ago, looking at the paintings on the wall, the artist, and thinking, wow, this painting's from 200 years ago. Somebody was alive 200 years ago and painted this, and it's a masterpiece now, and it's a work of art, and here it is in this museum. Those memories are powerful because they connect knowledge with experience. And that connection is exactly what the early pioneers of experiential education were hoping to achieve. But starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, something began to shift in American education once again. The whole thought of accountability systems, it began changing how we do things. Standardized tests started to increase and become more frequent across grade levels. Instructional time became more scrutinized and protected. And as a result, field trips started evolving a little bit. In some cases, they became more structured. In other cases, they became harder to justify. And that shift changed how schools approached field trips moving forward. And that's exactly where we're going to go next in part of today's conversation, that involvement of, from what they were to what they are now. Because the story of field trips doesn't end with the memories and the nostalgia. In many ways, the most interesting part of the story is what we're going to talk about next. Because for decades, field trips were a fairly common and widely accepted part of their school experience. We've got that understanding now. Like I said, teachers planned them, students looked forward to them, and administrators mostly focused on making sure the buses were scheduled and the permission slips were signed and turned in. But as education entered that period of the 1990s and early 2000s, that's when we saw that shift. The entire system of accountability came into place. And if you've worked in education long enough, you probably already know what word started showing up everywhere. Like I said, accountability. School districts across the country were under increasing pressure to demonstrate measurable student learning. Standardized testing expanded, curriculum frameworks became more detailed, they actually became a thing, and schools were expected to show that instructional time was being used in ways that directly supported and impacted academic standards. In that environment, the traditional idea of a field trip started getting a little more scrutiny and started to fade away a little bit. Because when you really think about it, a field trip removes students from the classroom for an entire day, sometimes even longer. And when instructional time becomes a highly protected resource, people start asking a question that they hadn't been always asking before. Is this trip actually contributing to student learning? Now, to be fair, many field trips absolutely did. Visiting a science center during a physics unit or exploring a historical site during a social studies unit could absolutely enhance student understanding, no question about it. But what began happening was a shift in how schools required teachers to plan and justify those experiences. We administrators started asking teachers to be much more explicit about the purpose of the trip. What are students supposed to learn? How does the trip connect to curriculum or standards? What academic standards does it support? And how will teachers measure whether this experience actually helped students learn something? Now, for some educators, this shift felt frustrating. It felt like something joyful was being buried under the paperwork or sucked out of the whole experience. From an administrative perspective, the motivation was pretty understandable, though. If a district is accountable for student learning outcomes, then every major instructional decision, including leaving the building for a day, has to connect back to that mission. And so what began to emerge in many schools was a new term, not just field trips. Let's call them learning trips. Remember that? Or maybe it was instructional excursions. Well, curriculum connected experiences, perhaps. Different districts use different language, but the idea was the same. A field trip wasn't just an outing anymore. It was supposed to be an extension of the classroom instruction. And I think we're still there today. Teachers were now being asked to show that the trip had a clear instructional purpose tied to the curriculum. And this is where things started getting a little more structured. If you talk to teachers today, especially those who started their career before the accountability era, so people like me, my generation, so we'll just say 50-ish, okay? If you're in your 50s, that era of accountability really took hold, and they'll often tell you that planning a field trip now looks very different than it used to. In many schools, the process begins with a formal proposal, something that's going to have to be approved by administration. They outline which units of instruction the experience connects to. They identify the standards that will be supported. They explain what students will do during the trip and how the experiences will connect to the classroom learning. Sometimes they include pre-trip and post-trip activities. I've seen that before. What will the students learn before they go? What assignments or reflections will happen afterward? And the goal of this structure isn't necessarily to eliminate field trips. It's to make sure they are intentionally designed as part of the learning process. Think of it this way. If a student spends 6 hours outside the classroom, the expectation is that those 6 hours should still function as instructional time, not just recreation. And in many ways, that idea actually aligns pretty closely with the original philosophy behind field trips. Remember the experiential learning ideas that we talked about earlier in this episode? The goal was always to connect real-world experiences with the academic learning. The difference now is that schools want those connections to be clearly documented. We got to have that paper trail. And sometimes that documentation can feel extensive, overwhelming. Teachers may need to coordinate with transportation, secure approval from the administration. Then you got to arrange chaperones, confirm safety procedures. Do we need a defibrillator? Do we have all of our meds for our kids? Provide that medical information for students, communicate expectations to families, and of course, collect the famous permission slips. We still got to have permission slips, though I've been in some schools most recently where we do like a blanket permission slip as part of the yearly registration back to school forms, where they sign one slip and it covers everything, which I don't know that I like that, because these trips come up then and parents kind of forget about it and like, I didn't get permission for my child to go. Yes, you did when you signed that blanket permission slip. But either way, we got to still collect them. Which, if you've ever organized a field trip, you already know is sometimes the most stressful part of the whole process, those darn permission slips. Because somehow there's always that one student whose permission slip never seems to make it back, no matter how many reminders are sent home. And the night before the trip, someone inevitably sends an email saying, oh, we just found the paper in the bottom of the backpack. Or I've even made phone calls the day of to get a verbal from a parent because we haven't got that slip back. And honestly, I didn't want to babysit a kid in the office. You know what I'm talking about. Field trip logistics can just simply be complicated. But once the paperwork is approved, there's still another big question that schools have to figure out. How do we pay for it? Where's the money coming from, Mr. Principal Man or woman? Field trips are amazing opportunities for students. There's no question there, but they're also not cheap these days because just bus transportation alone is a major expense. You've got fuel, you've got the driver, you got mileage. School buses cost money to operate, folks. Drivers have to be scheduled. Fuel prices fluctuate from week to week sometimes, like they are right now. And in some cases, especially for longer trips, districts may even need to hire outside transportation companies, those touring buses. And then there's, admission fees. Museums charge for educational programs. Science centers charge for exhibits. Theaters charge for performances. There's not many cheap field trips out there these days, unless you go out to nature. Even nature centers, though, charge for guided programs, and all those costs can add up quickly. So schools typically rely on a combination of funding sources to make field trips possible. The most common approach is parent contributions. Just reach out your hand and ask parents to please pay for that admission fee to the zoo. Families are asked to pay a small fee, sometimes to cover part of the trip expenses. Sometimes it's $5. Sometimes it's $20 if you're going to the Fort Wayne Zoo, but we'll just leave that there for right now. And that's not a slam. We love our zoo, but it's expensive for kids and families. Sometimes it's even more depending on the destination that you're going to. And many families are happy to contribute because they want their children to have those experiences. But that model also raises an important issue. equity. Not every family can easily afford additional school costs. Think about the families that are on free and reduced lunches and textbooks. We're still asking them to pay the same amount as everybody else for a field trip. Is that equitable? Schools have to be very careful not to create situations where students feel excluded or embarrassed because of financial circumstances. Many districts address this by offering scholarships or confidential assistance for families who need support. I've done that before. We don't want to leave anybody out, but we know sometimes they need some help. And even with those kind of things in place, the financial side of a field trip can still be really quite complicated. And that's why many schools rely heavily on support organizations like their PTOs and parent groups. PTAs, PTOs often help subsidize field trips by raising money through fundraisers and events throughout the year. Sometimes local businesses can be tapped into and ask for donations of money to support those educational experiences. Community organizations occasionally sponsor trips connected to their mission. Teachers may even apply for small educational grants. We do that at our building. That way it helps fund those experiential learning opportunities. It often takes a patchwork of resources, honestly, to make field trips financially possible these days. And even then, some schools have to limit how many trips they offer each year because budgets are real. Transportation cost is real, and the realities influence the decision that we administrators have to make at the end of the day. And while funding and logistics are major factors, another force was quietly reshaping field trips over the past 2 decades: technology. And that brings us to something that changed education dramatically: virtual learning experiences. Because suddenly schools had a new question to consider. What if students could visit places around the world without even leaving their classroom? And that idea opened up an entirely new category of learning experiences: virtual field trips. And that's where the conversation around field trips really starts getting quite interesting, because virtual experiences solved some problems, but also created some new questions. And that's exactly where we're heading right now in this conversation. We'll talk about how virtual field trips actually work. How are schools using them today? What alternatives some districts are exploring in this process, and what the future of field trips might look like for the next generation of students. Because the yellow school bus may always be a symbol of education for a while now, probably for many, many more years to come. But the way students explore the world through school might look very different in the years ahead. And that's something worth thinking about, but even more worth talking about. Because for decades, field trips were a fairly common and widely accepted part of school experiences. Again, teachers planned them, students looked forward to them, administrators focused on making sure that we had everything ready to go. Over the past decade, and especially during the pandemic, another major development began reshaping how students experience the world through school: virtual field trips. Now, when people first hear that phrase, they sometimes assume it's just a video or a slideshow, but the reality is that virtual field trips have evolved into something much more interactive than that. And for schools trying to balance budgets, transportation, safety, and instructional time, they've opened up some interesting possibilities. Let's start with a virtual field trip and what it actually looks like. In many cases, it's an interactive digital experience that allows students to explore real-world locations using technology. Students might take a guided tour of a museum using a digital platform. They might explore historical landmarks through interactive maps. They might even connect live with scientists, historians, or researchers who are working in the field at that very moment. Some cases, classrooms can literally travel across the globe without even leaving their desks. Students can explore coral reefs. They can walk through ancient ruins. They can observe wildlife in national parks. And the technology behind these experiences has become surprisingly sophisticated. One of the most widely used tools in schools today is Google Earth. Teachers can guide students through immersive satellite imagery, zooming from a global view down to street-level perspectives. Students can explore cities, landscapes, and landmarks in ways that textbooks simply can't replicate. Another major platform educators use is Google Arts and Culture. This tool allows students to virtually visit museums and cultural institutions from around the world. They can explore famous paintings, historical artifacts, and exhibits from institutions that many students would never, ever have the opportunity to visit in person. The Smithsonian Institution, for example, has invested heavily in creating digital access to its collections. Students can explore exhibits, watch expert-led presentations, and interact with educational content directly from their classrooms. And what makes these experiences powerful is accessibility. A school in a rural community like mine can explore the Louvre in Paris. A classroom in a small town can visit a NASA research center. Students can explore the Great Barrier Reef or the pyramids of Egypt, and they can do it without paying for transportation, paying admission, or even lodging. For schools working with limited budgets, that's a huge advantage. But virtual field trips also have some limitations because while technology can simulate many experiences, it can't fully replace the sensory aspects of being somewhere physically. You can watch animals on a screen, but it's not the same as standing a few feet away from a giraffe at the zoo. You can explore a museum exhibit online, but it's not the same as walking through the gallery and seeing artifacts right up close and in person. You can tour a historical site digitally, but it's different from standing in the exact place where historical or history actually happened. Physical presence matters. And that's why most educators see virtual field trips not as replacements, but I would say more like complements to traditional experiences. They can prepare students for a physical trip, they can extend learning afterward, or they can provide experiences that would otherwise be impossible. And as technology continues improving, especially with virtual reality and immersive simulations, the line between physical and digital experiences may continue to blur just a bit. But virtual trips aren't the only alternative schools are exploring. In fact, many districts are rethinking the entire concept of experiential learning. One strategy that's becoming increasingly popular is flipping the traditional model. Instead of taking students to the experience, schools bring the experience to the students. We do this with a local place in Fort Wayne called Science Central. They come to us, and they do science experiments for our first graders, I believe, once a month. It's been a great program. And it just helps all the way around. You know, traveling educational programs have become incredibly common in schools today. Museums often send educators to schools with portable exhibits and hands-on activities. Science organizations, like I said, bring mobile labs. Historical groups perform reenactments or storytelling programs inside school auditoriums. Nature centers bring live animals into classrooms for educational demonstrations. Authors visit schools and talk about writing and storytelling. Scientists share research with students through live presentations. These programs can create powerful learning experiences without the logistical challenges of organizing an actual field trip. There's no transportation to arrange, no admission costs, no worries about large groups, navigating public spaces. Students stay on campus where it's safe while still experiencing something new and engaging. Another alternative many schools are exploring is community-based learning. This approach focuses on connecting students with local organizations and professionals. Instead of traveling long distances, students engage with community around them. Local business owners talk about entrepreneurship. Healthcare professionals discuss careers in medicine. Construction workers explain how buildings are designed to be built and how they're built. Public safety officials share how emergency services operate. These kinds of experiences help students see how classroom learning connects to real careers and communities. And they can be incredibly powerful for older students who are starting to think about their futures and their career choices. Career exploration days are becoming more common in middle schools and high schools. Students visit workplaces. They observe professions and professionals in action. They learn about pathways into different industries. In many ways, these experiences function like field trips, but with a much stronger focus on career readiness. Another growing movement is outdoor learning, and I kind of hinted at this before with our Kinder Forest program. Schools are creating nature-based programs that bring students outside regularly. School gardens, outdoor classrooms, environmental stewardship projects. Students learn science ecology, and sustainability by actively engaging with the natural world. These programs often happen right on school property or in nearby parks. For us, we have a great outdoor facility right on campus. We're very fortunate and we make use of it. These programs are important for just another way for kids to learn outside of the classroom. It happens that they can occur more frequently than actual traditional field trips. Instead of one big experience per year, students might have dozens of smaller experiential learning opportunities throughout the school year. For us, we go out once a month, sometimes more often. But all that raises an interesting question. If schools are creating more on-campus experiences, does that mean traditional field trips are disappearing? Not necessarily. Let's just say they're evolving. If you ask educators where field trips are heading into the future, you'll probably hear a variety of options and opinions. Some believe traditional trips will always remain a central part of the school experience. There's something special about leaving the building, traveling somewhere new, and exploring the world beyond the classroom. Those moments create memories, no doubt about it. They build excitement about learning, and they strengthen relationships between the students and the teachers. And they give students experiences that they may remember for decades. Others believe the model will become more hybrid. Students might prepare for a trip through virtual exploration, then visit the location in person, then complete a digital project afterwards. Technology and physical experiences working together. Some districts may focus more heavily on career-connected trips that expose students to real workplace and industry. Others may prioritize environmental education and outdoor learning. And some schools may reduce field trips simply because of the financial and logistical challenges that lay ahead of them. But regardless of how the format changes, the core idea behind the field trip will probably always remain the same. Learning doesn't only happen inside classrooms. Sometimes the most powerful lessons happen when students step outside those walls, when they see how science works in real laboratories, when they stand in places where history unfolded, when they observe the ecosystems that they've been studying about in their textbooks and classrooms, when they realize the concepts they're learning about actually exist in the real world. That moment, when learning becomes real, is so incredibly powerful. And that's really what field trips have always been about. From the earliest days of experiential education to the modern era of virtual exploration, the goal has been the same: helping students connect knowledge with experience, helping them see the world more clearly, helping them understand that education isn't just something that happens in a classroom, it's something that exists everywhere. So the next time a permission slip comes home in a backpack, or a teacher starts planning a trip for their class, or a bus full of excited students pulls out of the school parking lot, it's worth remembering that those experiences are part of a much larger story in education, a story about curiosity, about exploration, a story about the belief that sometimes the best way to learn something is to go see it for yourself. Thanks for joining me today on Interventions and Detentions. If this episode brought back some memories of your own school field trips, or if you have a great story from one that you've taken as a teacher, I'd love to hear about it. Make sure to share it out on our social media post when this episode airs on Friday. Like I said, share on social media, tag the podcast, keep the conversation going. I'd love to hear about your field trip experiences. Because in education, the learning doesn't stop when the bell rings. Sometimes it starts when the bus pulls out of the parking lot. Tune in again next week and every week right here on Interventions and Detentions. We're on every pretty much possible podcast platform that you can think of. Pick your favorite one, search us up, and start listening. We are on season 2. This is episode 27, I believe. So there's lots of content out there for you to catch up on if you're just joining us for the first time. We talk about how field trips evolved. This podcast has evolved over the last year. So check out the early episodes, season 1 with Kylie and I together, and with Brad solo this year for season 2. Tune in each and every week. Episodes drop at 8 a.m. on Friday mornings, but you can catch them anytime after that. Interventions and Detentions. Thanks for tuning in. It's where the real learning begins. See you next time.